Grace and peace to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I don't know about you, but I was a big fan of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Remember that? Did you listen to that on the radio? Well, let me tell you the rest of the story from 1 Kings 17, which is in your bulletin. We heard the miracle of the provision of meal and oil. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house of Zarephath, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. She then said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin in remembrance and to cause the death of my son." But he said to her, "Give me your son." He took him from her bosom, carried him up into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. Then Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." So the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." So did you notice the parallels between that story in the Old Testament and the gospel story of Jesus raising the dead son? 2 grieving widows, 2 glorious resurrections. Last week we heard from 1 Kings 18. You remember the Elijah in the battle of the gods, Baal versus Yahweh? Elijah's name means Yahweh is my God. And this week we go back in 1 Kings a chapter. Now Elijah has continued to flee from King Ahab's wrath because of the drought that Ahab blames Elijah for in the land. Elijah called down the drought as God's punishment on this evil king. And after proclaiming that judgment, he went and hid from Ahab and Jezebel. And now God tells Elijah to go to Zarephath. Now this is in Phoenicia, which is the heart of Baal worship. This is before the battle of the gods. And God tells Elijah to live there, to be present there. And God says, "For I have commanded a widow there to feed you." Now this makes no sense. Why go into the land of Baal just so a widow could feed him? Why this widow? But Elijah obeys, and at the gates of the town he finds the widow. She's gathering sticks. He asks her for some water and a snack, a morsel of bread. Remember, the land is suffering due to drought. And she says, "As the Lord your God lives," notice that, it's your God that's doing this, "I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And the reason I'm gathering these sticks is to make a fire, make one last meal for my son and me, and die." So what's God up to here? Elijah tells her, "Do not be afraid." And he tells her to go make him a cake and then make for her and her son a meal. This sounds a little selfish, putting himself first, but it's not, because he's promising that God will keep that jar of meal and that jug of oil full for the duration of the drought. God will provide. And that's exactly what happens. It was a miracle of provision, meeting the needs of daily life. Pretty cool miracle, actually. And then comes a miracle of resurrection, of life overcoming death. And it says after this, and we don't know how long, but Elijah is still obeying God's command and still living there. The son of the widow becomes severely ill, stops breathing. The woman gets angry at Elijah in her grief. She says, "What have you got against me, O man of God?" But Elijah takes the boy from her, carries him up to his room upstairs, lays him out of the bed, and cries out to God. Why, God? None of this makes any sense. You tell me to come here and live with this foreign widow in a godless land and be fed by her, and now you take her son's life? Yet he stretched himself on the child 3 times, crying out to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. And God listens, and the life is restored. He revived. See, your son is alive, the woman says, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. First miracle apparently didn't convince her, but that's what grief can do. And then in the Gospel, Luke 7, another widow's son is healed by Jesus. Remember last week we saw the unshakable faith of the Roman centurion who asked Jesus to heal his servant from a distance. And his faith amazed Jesus. And now, in this case, there's no faith expressed or noted of the widow. It's simply Jesus' compassion to heal her son. So he goes to this town Nain, near Nazareth, his hometown, and huge crowds are following him. And as he approaches the town gate, just as Elijah approached the town gate in Zarephath, this dead man is being carried out, accompanied by his mother and another large crowd of mourners. And Luke says this man was the woman's only son, and she was a widow, which means she faced destitution. She had no means of support. So these 2 huge crowds converge to witness what happens. And Luke says when Jesus saw her, he had compassion for her. It was the deep, visceral, gut-wrenching kind of compassion that we feel when someone is grieving deeply. He tells her, do not weep. Now there's no reaction recorded in Luke, but that's a strong command, and it makes no sense. Why wouldn't she weep? The word for weep here that Jesus uses is typically used for that wet, wild wailing that people have when they have absolutely lost all hope. She's lost hope in a real way since her last soul provider has died. And Jesus was telling her not to give up hope. But he simply touches the bier on which her son lay, which made him ritually unclean according to the Jewish laws. But that had never stopped him before. And he simply speaks. No need to do what Elijah did, throwing himself on top of the kid 3 times. He just says, young man, I say to you, rise. And the dead man sits up and begins to talk. Have to wonder what he said. And it says, fear seized all of them, the fear of the Lord. They glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us. It's like Elijah has returned, but Jesus trumps Elijah. And so words spreads about him throughout the whole country. So 2 grieving widows, 2 glorious resurrections. Nothing was making any sense until God breaks through with resurrection power. So what is God telling us through all this? Well, let's go back to Elijah. It all started with God's strange command to go now to Zarephath and live there with the widow. Go to a land outside your comfort zone. Ground zero for Baal worship. Go there and live with a vulnerable person. The command was not to go do something for this vulnerable woman, but to go and be with her and her son. Be in a real relationship, which implies mutuality. Spend time with them. Love them. Treat them as people from whom you have as much to learn as to teach, and by whom you need to be fed as much as you need to feed. And by building this relationship, eventually we stop thinking of those who are different from us, those who society calls and treats as unclean or undesirable or unsuccessful losers or them, and realize that they are a critical part of us. So the real miracle here is not so much Elijah's raising of the widow's son from death, but that Elijah, at God's command, went to Zarephath, lived with this widow, got to know her and her son, built a true relationship, with this family from a different land, a different culture, different neighborhood, even a different religion from his. In short, go live with the enemy. And in the same way, in Jesus, God took human form and came to live with us, even in our pain and our grief and our fears. Were we God's enemies? Well, humanity certainly doesn't have a good track record of living as God's people in God's image over the centuries. Jesus calls his followers to do the same. Go and be with the other, the poor, the oppressed, the outcast, unclean, the different, the vulnerable in the world. Go live with those in pain and grief. Yes, he calls us to feed the hungry, to heal the broken in body and spirit, to provide for the needy, but also to just sit down and eat with these folks. So we have to ask ourselves, who in our neighborhoods are not really feeling welcome? Who is still them to us? Elijah was in a desperate situation. He was fleeing for his life with no food or shelter. Nevertheless, he was able to be God's hands and feet on earth when he and the foreign widow and her son, in equally dire straits, end up caring for one another. And that's when resurrection happens.